At 23 minutes past midnight on June 6, 1944, Sergeant Joseph Beyrle found himself in the open doorway of a C-47 transport aircraft suspended above the Normandy coastline. He watched as fiery tracer rounds ascended from 300 feet below, aiming for his plane. 20 years old, he had already completed 2 clandestine missions into occupied France, yet had 0 combat jumps to his name. German anti-aircraft batteries had already torn apart 6 transports within his formation. By the time dawn broke, 1,200 American paratroopers would be dead, wounded, or captured. The 101st Airborne Division was being deployed into a veritable kill zone, and Beyrle's aircraft was flying far too low and too fast. The signal light never illuminated. Shrapnel ripped through the fuselage. The pilot executed a sharp bank, and Beyrle was ejected from the door at 360 feet. The standard jump altitude was 1,200 feet. At 360 feet, his parachute had a mere 4 seconds to deploy before impact. Miraculously, it opened. He plunged through the roof of a church in Sainte-Mère-Église and landed in the adjacent cemetery. His unit, his stick, was scattered across 15 miles of Norman farmland. He was entirely alone, armed with a Thompson submachine gun, explosives, and the crucial objective of destroying a power station. Most paratroopers who found themselves isolated that night perished alone. German patrols were meticulously sweeping the hedgerows. Machine gun emplacements controlled every intersection. Snipers lay in wait within church bell towers. The prudent course of action would have been to conceal himself, link up with friendly forces, and endure until the beaches were secured. Beyrle, however, did not hide. He spent 3 days undertaking solo sabotage operations deep behind enemy lines. He successfully demolished the power station. He severed vital communication lines. He moved through German-occupied territory like a phantom, equipped with his demolition kit. On June 9th, his fortune turned. While crawling through a hedgerow near Carrington, he stumbled directly into a German machine gun nest. 4 enemy soldiers, 4 weapons, 0 opportunities for evasion. The Germans did not immediately open fire. They sought intelligence. They were desperate to learn about the invading force, the designated landing beaches, and the airborne objectives. Beyrle divulged only his name, his rank, and his serial number, withholding any further information. What transpired next would profoundly shape the ensuing 7 months of his existence. The Germans observed his identification tags. They noticed his surname, Beyrle, which sounded remarkably similar to a German name. His paternal grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria in the 1800s. To the interrogators, this perceived heritage transformed him into something far worse than a mere enemy soldier. It rendered him a traitor to his own blood. They confiscated his identification tags and presented them to a German infiltrator, a spy fluent in English who was tasked with attempting to penetrate Allied lines while wearing an American uniform. Tragically, that spy met his end 3 weeks later near the front lines. American soldiers discovered the body. Among his possessions, they found the dog tags. They identified the name as Joseph Beyrle. On June 10, 1944, the United States War Department officially declared Sergeant Joseph Beyrle killed in action on French soil. A telegram arrived at his parents' residence in Muskegon, Michigan. His mother collapsed upon reading the somber news. His father, a factory worker who had lost his livelihood during the Great Depression, who had stood in bread lines with his children, and who had witnessed the death of one daughter from scarlet fever, now learned that his son had fallen in Normandy. The local parish priest scheduled a funeral mass. The regional newspaper published an obituary. Friends and neighbors filled the church pews, offering prayers for the soul of Joseph Beyrle, who had died during the liberation of France. Yet, Joseph Beyrle was not dead. He was confined to a German interrogation room, 400 meters to the east, a silent witness as his captors brutally beat another American prisoner unconscious. To witness how Beyrle managed to survive the subsequent 7 months of Nazi captivity, please engage the like button. Your support significantly aids in sharing these often forgotten narratives. Kindly subscribe if you haven't already. Returning to Beyrle's story. The interrogators transferred him to his initial prison camp in late June. It would not be his last. Over the ensuing 7 months, Sergeant Joseph Beyrle would be moved through 7 distinct German penal facilities. He would attempt escape on 3 separate occasions. He would endure beatings, starvation, and torture at the hands of the Gestapo. And somewhere within the desolate, frozen expanse of occupied Poland, he would make a monumental decision, a choice that no American soldier had ever contemplated before. The German military prison system operated on a straightforward principle. Disruptive individuals were sent eastward. The further east a prisoner was relocated, the harsher the conditions became. The closer they were moved to the advancing Soviet front, the less food, less heat, and consequently, less chance of survival they possessed. Beyrle quickly established himself as a troublemaker. His first escape attempt occurred in July 1944, somewhere in France. A column of prisoners was being marched towards a railway station when American fighter bombers appeared overhead. The guards dispersed in panic. Explosions ripped through the road. Amidst the chaos, Beyrle fled. He managed to evade capture for 16 hours. German patrols apprehended him the following morning, discovering him in a drainage ditch. They subjected him to severe beatings with rifle butts and added his name to a watch list. Escape risk. Watch closely. Transfer east. The second escape attempt took place in October. By this point, Beyrle had passed through 4 different camps, each progressively further from Allied lines. He had learned to bribe guards with cigarettes, to barter information for sustenance, and to subsist on diluted soup and moldy bread. He had also become aware that the Soviet army was making substantial advances through Poland. He reasoned that if he could reach the Eastern Front, he might encounter allies. He, along with 2 other prisoners, slipped away from a work detail and reached a rail yard. Their objective was to find a train heading eastward towards Poland. In the darkness, they concealed themselves within a freight car and waited. The train departed, heading westward, directly towards Berlin. German railway workers discovered them at a switching station within the capital. They promptly alerted the Gestapo. What followed were the most harrowing 10 days of Joseph Beyrle's life. The Gestapo operated entirely outside the framework of the Geneva Convention. They did not acknowledge prisoners of war. They perceived 3 men in American uniforms arriving in Berlin by train and drew a swift, logical conclusion. Spies, saboteurs, paratroopers dispatched to assassinate Nazi leadership. The interrogations commenced immediately. Beyrle was stripped, beaten, and suspended by his arms, his body twisted backward at an unnatural angle, dislocating his shoulders. His interrogators employed whips, clubs, and rifle butts. They relentlessly demanded information regarding American spy networks in Berlin, the identities of German collaborators, and confessions to fabricated crimes. Beyrle provided them with nothing. He could not reveal what he did not possess. However, the Gestapo remained unconvinced. The beatings persisted for over a week, punctuated by sleep deprivation, starvation, and mock executions where guards pressed pistols to his head, pulling triggers on empty chambers. On the 10th day, Beyrle and his fellow prisoners were lined up against a wall. A firing squad assembled. The Gestapo commander declared that American spies would face execution for their crimes against the Reich. The bullets never flew. At the last possible moment, Wehrmacht officers arrived, bearing official documentation. The German military had traced the prisoners back to their original camp. They possessed irrefutable proof that these men were captured soldiers, not spies. The Gestapo had no jurisdiction over them. The prisoners belonged to the army. A heated debate ensued for 3 hours. Ultimately, the army prevailed. Beyrle was pulled from the execution wall and transferred to military custody. He should have experienced a profound sense of relief. Instead, he felt something entirely different. Unadulterated rage. 7 months of captivity, 7 camps, 2 failed escape attempts. His family believed him deceased. The war was drawing to a close, and he was languishing in a prison cell while countless other men fought and died. In late December 1944, the Germans transferred him to Stalag 3C, a vast prisoner of war camp situated near the town of Alt-Dürhennersdorf in occupied Poland. The facility housed 12,000 prisoners, fortified with barbed wire, guard towers, and machine guns. However, the prisoners at Stalag 3C possessed information that the Germans desperately wished to conceal. The sound of Soviet artillery could be heard to the east. The Red Army was advancing. The front was in a state of collapse. And within the turmoil of a collapsing front, a determined individual might discover an opportunity. Beyrle began formulating plans for his third escape. This time, his objective was not to flee west towards the Americans, but to move east, directly towards the sounds of battle. The escape materialized during the first week of January 1945. Soviet artillery had been relentlessly bombarding German positions for days. The guards were visibly nervous, their attention diverted, their gaze fixed on the eastern horizon rather than on the inmates. Beyrle had meticulously saved cigarettes for weeks, engaging in trades, hoarding them, accumulating a form of currency that proved more valuable than money within the disintegrating Reich. He bribed a guard to overlook his actions during a work detail. He slipped through a breach in the barbed wire fence, which had been deliberately cut during the night. He crawled through frozen mud until he reached the tree line, then rose and sprinted eastward, guided by the rumble of distant artillery. 2 other prisoners accompanied him on his escape. Within hours, however, German patrols apprehended them both. Beyrle heard the baying of dogs, heard the sharp crack of gunfire, but continued running. He did not stop to render aid. He could not afford to stop. To halt would render his 7 months of arduous survival utterly meaningless. For 2 weeks, he traversed occupied Poland during the harsh winter. Temperatures plummeted below freezing. He possessed no map, no compass, and no provisions beyond what he could scrounge from abandoned farmhouses. He navigated by sound, following the continuous booming of Soviet artillery, sleeping in barns and drainage ditches, meticulously avoiding roads where German units were in chaotic retreat westward. His physical condition deteriorated rapidly. The brutal torture inflicted by the Gestapo had left permanent damage. His shoulders ached incessantly from the dislocations. His ribs, fractured during the beatings, had never properly healed. He was severely malnourished, suffering from frostbite, subsisting on sheer willpower and simmering rage. In mid-January, he spotted them. A column of tanks advancing through a small village. These were not German tanks. They were Soviet T-34s, their hulls painted white for winter camouflage, with distinctive red stars visible on their turrets. Beyrle had precisely one chance to avoid being shot. Soviet soldiers were known to fire first and ask questions later. An unidentified figure approaching their lines in the midst of a war zone was perceived as a target, not a refugee. He raised his hands above his head. In one hand, he clutched a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes. These were unmistakably American cigarettes. He advanced slowly towards the tank, shouting the only Russian phrases he knew. The tankers did not shoot. They surrounded him, rifles raised, shouting questions he couldn't comprehend. A political officer arrived, a commissar who spoke rudimentary English. Beyrle explained his situation. American paratrooper, prisoner of war, escaped from German camp, wished to fight. The commissar refused. Regulations mandated that escaped Allied prisoners be evacuated through official channels. Moscow would ultimately decide the fate of an American soldier operating behind Soviet lines. Beyrle vehemently disagreed. He had not endured 7 months of captivity, torture, and a grueling 2-week trek across frozen Poland, only to languish in another holding facility, awaiting bureaucratic decisions. He craved a weapon. He yearned for retribution. He desired to eliminate Germans. The escalating argument attracted attention. The battalion commander arrived to investigate the commotion. Beyrle found himself standing before a Soviet officer unlike any he had anticipated. Alexandra Samusenko was 23 years old, the sole female tank commander in the 1st Guards Tank Army. 18 months prior, she had personally destroyed 3 German Tiger tanks during the Battle of Kursk. She had lost her husband to the Germans. She had lost her entire family. She understood the profound meaning of revenge. Samusenko overruled the commissar's decision. The American would remain. He would fight. Her battalion was advancing westward towards Berlin, and they were in dire need of every soldier capable of wielding a weapon. The Soviets issued Beyrle a uniform, a PPSH-41 submachine gun, and an assignment. He was to serve as infantry support for one of the battalion's tanks. The tank itself was American-made, an M4 Sherman, supplied through the Lend-Lease program. Sergeant Joseph Beyrle, of the 101st Airborne Division, United States Army, was now officially a soldier of the Soviet Red Army, riding an American tank towards Germany. No American had ever undertaken such a mission before. None would ever do so again. Somewhere behind them, Stalag 3C still held its 12,000 prisoners. Beyrle's battalion was advancing directly towards it. The Eastern Front bore no resemblance to the battlefields of Normandy. In France, there had been established protocols. Prisoners were taken. Civilians were spared whenever feasible. The Geneva Convention held a degree of significance, even if its application was imperfect. In Poland, however, there were no rules. The brutal conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union had claimed 20 million lives in 4 years. Villages lay in ruins. Entire populations had vanished. Wehrmacht soldiers and Red Army troops systematically slaughtered each other with industrial efficiency, and neither side harbored any expectation of mercy. Beyrle adapted rapidly. His demolition expertise proved invaluable. Soviet sappers shared their techniques with him, and he, in turn, demonstrated his. The Americans employed different fuses, different explosive charges, and distinct methodologies for demolishing bridges and fortifications. This exchange of knowledge was mutually beneficial. Within days, Beyrle was placing explosive charges on German bunkers alongside soldiers who spoke no English. The battalion pushed westward throughout January 1945. They advanced through terrain that resembled the very end of the world. Frozen fields strewn with burnt-out vehicles, towns reduced to rubble, bodies piled along roadsides, German, Soviet, and civilian alike, far too numerous to bury in the frozen earth. Beyrle rode on the rear deck of his Sherman tank, gripping his PPSH-41, his eyes scanning the tree lines for potential ambushes. The infantry support role was unforgiving. When the tanks engaged German positions, the foot soldiers advanced through a hail of crossfire. When German aircraft appeared overhead, the men on the ground had absolutely nowhere to seek cover. The Soviet soldiers accepted him with surprising swiftness. They were indifferent to politics or nationality. Their sole concern was whether a man could fight, whether he would hold his ground when the artillery began to fall. Beyrle proved his mettle in the very first engagement. He did not falter. He did not freeze. He advanced with the assault wave, utilizing his submachine gun in the same manner he had employed his Thompson in Normandy. The Russians affectionately referred to him as their American. They shared their rations with him: black bread, buckwheat porridge, and vodka that burned like gasoline. At night, gathered around fires kindled in the ruins of German farmhouses, they raised toasts to Stalin and Roosevelt, celebrating the alliance that was relentlessly crushing Hitler from both flanks. Beyrle acquired fragments of the Russian language, sufficient to comprehend orders, to alert comrades to incoming fire, and to share stories about his home, about Michigan, and about the family that believed him to be dead. The Soviets found this predicament both hilariously ironic and deeply tragic. They too had all experienced profound loss. Mothers, fathers, brothers, children. The German invasion had ravaged their homeland like a devastating plague. A man whose family merely presumed him deceased was considered fortunate by their standards. By late January, the battalion had advanced nearly 100 kilometers. German resistance was disintegrating. Entire units surrendered rather than face the formidable Soviet tanks. Others fought to the bitter end, fully aware of the grim fate that awaited them in Russian captivity. The advance slowed only when supply lines became excessively stretched or when Wehrmacht reinforcements arrived from collapsing sectors. Beyrle's commanding officers took notice of his remarkable effectiveness. Word spread throughout the division about the American paratrooper who had escaped a prison camp and voluntarily joined the fight. Some officers deemed him insane. Others considered him precisely the type of soldier this war demanded. A few discreetly arranged for additional ammunition and rations to be delivered to his unit. On the 28th of January, reconnaissance reports indicated a substantial German installation directly in the battalion's path, a prisoner of war camp. It held 12,000 Allied soldiers behind barbed wire, guarded by towers and machine gun positions, manned by a skeletal garrison of older soldiers and rear echelon troops, with most of the combat units having already retreated westward. The camp was identified as Stalag 3C, Beyrle's former confinement, the very place where he had conceived his final escape plan less than a month prior. His battalion received orders to liberate it at dawn. The assault commenced precisely at dawn on January 29, 1945. Soviet tanks advanced towards Stalag 3C from three distinct directions. Artillery softened the perimeter defenses. Machine guns raked the guard towers. The German garrison, heavily outnumbered and outgunned, capitulated within 2 hours. Beyrle entered the camp from which he had escaped only 3 weeks earlier. The barbed wire fences had been torn apart by the treads of the tanks. The guard towers were engulfed in flames. Prisoners streamed out of the barracks. Thousands of men clad in ragged uniforms, blinking in the harsh winter sunlight, struggling to comprehend that liberation had finally arrived. They gazed at the Soviet soldiers. They stared at the tanks, and some of them fixed their eyes upon the lone American, clad in a Red Army uniform, wielding a Soviet submachine gun, shouting in English for medical assistance and food. The prisoners who recognized him believed they were witnessing a phantom. Beyrle had escaped in early January. The Germans had officially reported him killed during the subsequent pursuit. Now, he had returned, adorned in the uniform of a different army, leading the charge to liberate the very camp that had held him captive. There was no time for protracted reunions. The battalion was under orders to continue its westward advance. German forces were regrouping ahead, and the window for rapid progression was rapidly closing. Beyrle assisted in organizing the evacuation of the most critically ill prisoners, directed Soviet medical teams to attend to the most severe cases, and then clambered back onto his Sherman tank, rejoining the advancing column. The offensive pressed onward through the first week of February. Resistance intensified as the Soviets neared German territory. Wehrmacht units that had been in retreat suddenly turned to engage, launching fierce counterattacks against the flanks. Luftwaffe aircraft appeared over the battlefield in numbers not witnessed since the preceding summer. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers were considered obsolete by 1945 standards, slow, vulnerable, and easy targets for modern fighters. However, against ground troops lacking air cover, they remained devastatingly effective. The distinctive Stuka siren, specifically designed to terrorize infantry during its dive, still functioned precisely as intended. On February 3rd, Beyrle's battalion was advancing across open terrain when the air raid siren wailed. 6 Stukas emerged from the east, descending rapidly towards the tank column. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Tank commanders sealed their hatches. The infantry scattered for cover. Beyrle was 50 meters from his Sherman when the first bomb detonated. The explosion hurled him sideways. Shrapnel ripped through his legs. A second bomb landed significantly closer. The concussive force slammed him into the frozen earth. He lay in a freshly formed crater as the attack continued. Bombs systematically traversed the field. Tanks erupted in flames. Men screamed in agony. The Stukas completed 3 passes before Soviet fighter aircraft arrived on the scene, driving them away. When the medics finally reached him, Beyrle was unconscious and bleeding profusely from multiple wounds. His left leg was shattered below the knee. Shrapnel had penetrated his back, his arms, and his abdomen. The Soviet field surgeons held little hope for his survival through the night. They evacuated him to a military hospital in Landsberg, located 60 kilometers behind the front lines. The facility was severely overwhelmed. Wounded soldiers filled every available bed, lined the corridors, and occupied every conceivable space. Surgeons worked around the clock, performing amputations, extracting shrapnel fragments, and combating infections with limited antibiotic supplies. Beyrle survived the first night, then the second. His body, hardened by 7 months of captivity and brutal abuse, refused to surrender. The Soviet doctors performed 3 surgeries within the first week, removing shrapnel, cleaning his wounds, and desperately attempting to save his leg. He was the sole non-Soviet patient in the entire hospital. Word of the American soldier spread rapidly among the staff. Nurses frequented his bedside, eager to catch a glimpse of the paratrooper who had escaped German captivity and fought alongside the Red Army. Doctors discussed his extraordinary case in hushed tones in the hallways. Eventually, news of his presence reached someone with the authority to investigate. A distinguished visitor was en route. The most formidable military commander in the Soviet Union desired to meet the American soldier in Ward 7. Marshal Georgy Zhukov was the most celebrated military leader in Soviet history. He had single-handedly saved Moscow in 1941. He had shattered the German siege of Stalingrad. He had decisively crushed the Wehrmacht at Kursk in the largest tank battle ever recorded. Now, he was leading the final Soviet offensive towards Berlin, and somehow, he had found the time to visit a wounded American soldier in a Polish hospital. In mid-February, Marshal Zhukov arrived in Landsberg, accompanied by a modest group of his staff officers and translators. The hospital's commanding officer guided him through the various wards, offering the marshal a stark glimpse into the heavy toll his army had endured in pursuit of victory. Hundreds of soldiers lay wounded, and dozens were succumbing to their injuries, a grim testament to the human price of the offensive, measured in lost limbs and broken bodies. It was in Ward 7 that they found Beyrle, an American serviceman in such a weakened state that he could barely remain upright, let alone stand. Yet, upon the entrance of the most influential general in the Soviet Union, he attempted a salute from his hospital cot. Zhukov halted the gesture and, through a translator, requested that Beyrle recount his experiences from the very beginning. Beyrle spoke for 20 minutes, with the interpreter relaying his narrative in segments. Zhukov listened intently, without interruption. The story encompassed his paratrooper jump on D-Day, his subsequent capture, his harrowing experiences in 7 different prisoner-of-war camps, enduring Gestapo torture, his daring escape across frozen Poland, a month spent fighting alongside Soviet tank crews, the liberation of his own former prison camp, and the Stuka attack that had nearly claimed his life. When Beyrle concluded, Zhukov remained silent for a considerable pause. He then addressed the American directly, even before the translation was complete. The marshal stated that he had never encountered such a profound account. He conveyed that Beyrle had merited the deep respect of the Soviet people and asserted that the alliance between their nations was forged through the courage of men like him, soldiers who fought irrespective of national insignia or territorial boundaries. Zhukov then inquired about Beyrle's wishes. His response was straightforward. He yearned to return home. His family believed him to be deceased. His mother had observed 8 months of mourning. He needed to reach the American embassy in Moscow to confirm he was still alive. The primary obstacle was a lack of proper identification. Beyrle possessed nothing. No identification, no military documentation, no proof of his nationality. The Germans had confiscated his dog tags in Normandy, while the Soviets had issued him a temporary soldier's booklet. It listed him as a member of the Red Army, not the United States military. Without adequate papers, travel was impossible. Without travel, Moscow was unreachable. Without reaching Moscow, he could not go home. Zhukov resolved the predicament with a simple signature. He instructed his staff to prepare official documentation recognizing Joseph Beyrle as an American soldier under Soviet protection. He authorized the necessary travel permits for Moscow and arranged for a military escort to transport the injured American once he was well enough to endure the journey. Before departing, the marshal extended his hand to Beyrle, offering him safe travels and wishing him a long life. He remarked that while their countries might recall this war in different ways, they should never forget their shared fight. 3 weeks later, Beyrle was evacuated from Landsberg. His leg had been successfully treated, although he would carry a permanent limp. Soviet medical personnel placed him on a truck bound eastward, away from the front lines and toward Moscow. The journey spanned 9 days, during which Beyrle traversed the devastated landscapes of German-occupied Poland and Soviet territories, ravaged by 4 years of total conflict. He witnessed scenes of ruin stretching to every horizon. In late February of 1945, the convoy finally arrived in Moscow. Beyrle was brought to the gates of the American embassy on Movaya Street. He wore a Soviet uniform and carried Soviet military papers authenticated by Marshal Zhukov. He claimed to be an American paratrooper presumed dead, who had spent the preceding month fighting with the Red Army. The Marine guards at the gate were deeply skeptical. The embassy staff had encountered numerous desperate individuals previously. Moscow in 1945 teamed with refugees, deserters, con artists, and Soviet operatives attempting to infiltrate American facilities. A man in a Red Army uniform claiming to be a deceased paratrooper fit the profile of a potential provocation. They detained him immediately. Marine guards escorted Beyrle to a holding room at the Metropole Hotel across the street. His Soviet documents were confiscated. He was photographed and interrogated with questions designed to reveal any inconsistencies in his account. Beyrle responded to every query, providing his serial number, unit designation, commanding officers, the name of the church in Saint-Côme-du-Mont, where his parachute had snagged on the roof, the date of his capture, the names of the POW camps, and specific details that a Soviet operative would be unlikely to possess. The embassy staff remained unconvinced, deeming his story too extraordinary. A paratrooper declared dead on D-Day, captured by the Germans, tortured by the Gestapo, escaped to fight with Soviet tanks, wounded in battle, and personally aided by Marshal Zhukov. It sounded like propaganda, like fiction. They sent a cable to Washington requesting verification. The War Department confirmed that Sergeant Joseph Beyrle of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, had been officially declared killed in action on June 10, 1944. A funeral mass had been held, and benefits had been dispersed to his family. The case was considered closed. The embassy requested Beyrle's fingerprints, as every American serviceman was fingerprinted upon enlistment. If this man was indeed Joseph Beyrle, his prints should match those on record at the War Department. The results arrived within 48 hours. A perfect match. 10 points of identification on each finger. The man at the Metropole Hotel was precisely who he claimed to be. The embassy swiftly moved to process his paperwork, including medical examinations, debriefings, the issuance of new identification documents, and arrangements for his transport home. The War Department issued a correction, officially changing Sergeant Joseph Beyrle's status from killed in action to alive and returning. On April 21, 1945, Beyrle arrived in the United States. He had been absent for 2 years and was considered dead for 10 months. He was 21 years old, walked with a permanent limp, and carried fragments of shrapnel in his body that would remain there for the rest of his life. 2 weeks later, Germany surrendered. Beyrle observed victory in Europe Day in Chicago, surrounded by strangers who had no inkling of his ordeal. His homecoming in Muskegon was a more subdued affair. His mother wept for 3 days. His father, a man who had endured Depression-era breadlines and buried one child while mourning another, spoke very little. Some experiences transcended the capacity of language. The following year, Beyrle married Joanne Hollowell. Their wedding ceremony took place at Holy Trinity Church in Muskegon, the very same church that had hosted his funeral mass. The priest who had prayed for his immortal soul now officiated his marriage. Among the congregation were neighbors who had attended both services. Beyrle never sought public attention. He returned to civilian life, securing a position at the Brunswick Corporation, where he served as a shipping supervisor for 28 years. He raised 3 children and attended veterans' reunions, speaking about the war only when directly asked. Recognition for his extraordinary service came much later. In 1994, during the 50th anniversary of D-Day, President Bill Clinton and Russian President Boris Yeltsin jointly presided over a ceremony at the White House. Veterans from both nations were invited to attend. Among them was a 70-year-old retired shipping supervisor from Michigan. Beyrle stood in the Rose Garden as the two presidents pinned medals to his chest. American decorations for his service in Normandy and Soviet decorations for his participation with the Red Army. He was the only individual in history to receive combat honors from both nations for the same conflict. His son, John, watched from the audience. 20 years later, that son would return to Moscow in a vastly different capacity. Joseph Beyrle passed away on December 12, 2004, at the age of 81. He died peacefully in his sleep during a visit to Toccoa, Georgia, the same town where he had undergone paratrooper training 62 years earlier. His remains were transported to Washington and interred with full military honors in Section 1 of Arlington National Cemetery. The woman who had saved his life did not survive the war. Alexandra Samusenko was killed on March 3, 1945, less than a month after Beyrle departed from her battalion. A Soviet tank crushed her during a nighttime maneuver near the village of Zulzitz, 70 kilometers from Berlin. She was 23 years old and never witnessed the victory for which she had fought. Beyrle learned of her death years later and spent decades attempting to locate her grave to honor the commander who had granted him a second chance at life during the war. He described her as a symbol of Soviet courage, a woman who had lost everything and continued to fight until she had nothing left to give. The legacy of his story unfolded gradually. In 2002, historian Thomas Taylor published a biography titled The Simple Sounds of Freedom. The book meticulously chronicled every detail of Beyrle's journey from Muskegon to Normandy and across the frozen plains of Poland. Veterans who had initially doubted his account found validation in military archives, Soviet records, and declassified documents. In 2005, the village of Saint-Côme-du-Mont unveiled a memorial plaque on the church where Beyrle had landed on D-Day. French officials, American veterans, and Beyrle's family gathered to honor the paratrooper whose crash through their roof had altered history. A permanent monument was dedicated at the same location in 2014. The Russians also remembered him. In 2010, the Moscow State Historical Museum hosted an exhibition titled A Hero of Two Nations. The displays featured Beyrle's Soviet uniform, his military documents signed by Zhukov, and photographs from his time with the tank battalion. The exhibition toured 3 other Russian cities before crossing the Atlantic to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. However, the most remarkable continuation of Joseph Beyrle's story came through his son. John Beyrle joined the United States Foreign Service after graduating from college, specializing in Russian affairs. He became fluent in the language and rose through the diplomatic ranks over 3 decades. In 2008, President George W. Bush appointed John Beyrle as the United States ambassador to Russia. The son of the only American to have fought for the Soviet Red Army now represented his country in Moscow, 63 years after his father had arrived in that same city, clad in a Soviet uniform and carrying documents signed by Marshal Zhukov. Ambassador Beyrle served until 2012. He walked the same streets his father had navigated as a wounded soldier and met with Russian veterans who remembered the Great Patriotic War. He honored the alliance that had defeated fascism, even as the relationship between the two nations grew increasingly complex in new ways. Joseph Beyrle never referred to himself as a hero. He believed the true heroes were the men who never returned home, the paratroopers who perished in Normandy, the prisoners who starved in German camps, and the millions of Soviet soldiers who fell while advancing westward toward Berlin. He attributed his survival to luck, sheer stubbornness, and the compassion of strangers who had no obligation to assist him. If this narrative has resonated with you as it has with us, please do us a favor and hit the like button. Every like signals to YouTube that this story should be shared with a wider audience. Subscribe and enable notifications as we dedicate ourselves to unearthing forgotten stories from dusty archives daily. Tales of paratroopers who refuse to yield, real people, and genuine heroism. Drop a comment now and tell us your location. Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia? Our global community spans the entire world. You are not merely a viewer, you are instrumental in preserving these memories. Please share your location and whether a family member served. Simply let us know you are here. Thank you for watching and for ensuring that Joseph Beyrle's story does not fade into silence. This man deserved to be remembered, and you are helping to make that a reality.